Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Yann Tavez, and it is my pleasure to welcome you for the second day of the AMDA Energy Catalyst, the Decade of the Mini-Grid event. I work at IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. I am in the infrastructure department, and I'm responsible for origination in infrastructure in West and Central Africa, as well as for mini-grids in Africa. Before joining the International Finance Corporation, I worked for about 6 years at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., where I cared about energy access globally, including off-grid, but working then more on the government side. I have introduced myself in such a way to introduce you what I'll be speaking to you about today. Instead of trying to provide you with grand thoughts and projection on what the mini-grid market will be or is likely to be in the years to come, I'll try to share with you a couple of learnings that I've had first working with government and now being on the investment slash lender side of things. So the first thing that I wanted to share is from my experience, at least, I feel the decade is coming and that this event is well entitled. I have seen the space evolved for a number of years, and I can see how things are accelerating and in the right direction, actually. First, you, as developers, you are in numbers now. You are more sophisticated than ever, and you're also delivering on the ground. And what you're doing every day is quite impressive to me and to a lot of other people. The second part is that governments are now really keen on mini-grid, and they are the one wanting mini-grids. The conversation that I have with governments today is so much more different than the one I had years ago. Back then, 8-10 years ago, we had to first explain what was a mini-grid to start with, and it wasn't clear to almost no one in government. Today, every government I speak to, they do know what mini-grid is, and in fact, they want it. So the question is not what anymore, is rather how do we make this happen? And that is changing the equation dramatically, I find. The third thing that strikes me currently is that the fact that financiers are stepping in. In the early days, you had a lot of small grants, programs, followed then by some equity boutique shops, providing some early stage financing, as well as some large group doing some equity positioning. But now what we're seeing is quite an interest from the larger DFIs, such as the one I work for, as well as more commercial lenders that are starting to get interested into the space, bringing their muscle and sophistication. And I see that as a very good sign. Now, what I have learned and the 2 points that I wanted to focus my intervention on today is 2 points that I think deserve our collective attention. And those 2 points are scale and de-risking. I'll start with scale. Scale, we all talk about it. It's absolutely needed. Obviously, it's needed for economies of scale to start with. First, for you developers to be able to provide those services at a lower cost and make those projects more sustainable. But scale has other advantages that I wanted to bring your attention on. First, it brings government attention. It is not the same thing when you are a government and you're dealing with a small program of $10, $20 million to now move into hundreds of million dollars. The attention that you get from governments, from political figures, is increasing. And that means that doors can be opened more easily. That means more capacity in government is made to make those projects work actually, and change the picture overall, including from a regulation standpoint. Scale brings also additional room for you guys, for developers, to innovate and also to grow and solidify your business, make it, you know, larger scale business that actually deliver infrastructure, because that's a business we're in. Finally, scale allows for a different kind of financiers to step in. I was referring to the organizations that I work for, where small tickets in the millions of dollars are difficult to attain. In fact, due to our structure, processes, and transaction costs. And it is true for many DFIs in that space. And scale allows them to participate into the market, into its growth, and also bring a different kind of approach to financing, and therefore to project discipline as well, which I believe is important for the sector to grow and to mature. No, we can all agree on scale. I think it's been repeated many, many times. The question for me is really, how do we get to scale? And my view is that because mini-grid is a regulated business, scale will, and that's what I see on the ground, is increasingly driven by governments and by donors that support governments. So what we emphasize, or what I emphasize, at least when I speak about scale with governments and donors, such as my colleagues from the World Bank, is that scale needs to be taken in consideration since the very beginning of project preparation, when you start preparing, selecting sites, for example. Scale can be seen at different levels. At the site level, we need to push for sites that are much larger, that, you know, provides a required growth load that allow for mini-grids to bring value on an economical standpoint. And that's very important, because a lot of the programs today that we see essentially targets smaller villages in very deep rural area, poor areas, which is all well and fine, but this needs to be balanced with larger sites. And in fact, I would argue that starting with larger sites is probably a better strategy for government in order to incentivize the private sector and allow you as developer and us as financiers to step in and really help this space to grow and those projects to be successful. Scale needs also to be looked at the portfolio level. In some form of government programs and procurements, we see government aggregating projects into concession areas. It is important that there, the concessions, the number of sites be increased, so that the transaction size, at the end of the day, what will be financed per project is also in the dozens of million kind of range. And finally, national programs need to step up, in terms of scale, meaning that the envelopes usually allocated by donors also need to increase forcefully. And we start to see some progress, large programs such as in Nigeria, DRC, a recent announcement for Chad, for example. This goes into the right direction, but this needs to continue and to also increase. There, at the national level, I believe that we need programs of the hundreds of millions of dollars range for us to bring to meaningfully bringing scale into the space. Now, when we talk about scales, there is a more fundamental point that I also wanted to make, is that mini-grids at the end of the day is infrastructure, and infrastructure is by definition needs scale. By definition. And so we need to start applying to mini-grids, I believe, the same code that prevails for the wider infrastructure business. After scale, the second thing that I wanted to share and talk about today, because I think it's prominent for us to make the decade of the mini-grid happen in reality, is on the importance of de-risking. And there, my first and biggest learning over the past couple of years being at IFC is around regulation, actually. You see, when I was at the World Bank, I've spent years trying to get regulation right, working with countries on longer term engagement, really putting those pieces of the puzzle together and advocating that regulation will de-risk investment. And that's a topic I see pretty much in every conference on mini-grids, and which is true in a sense. But what I learned recently and what I believe now is that regulation is important, but it's not sufficient. It's definitely not sufficient. And I think that today there is a need for us collectively to look at contracts, really at the contracts. When we look projects, when we look at government programs, what we don't see is the same sophistication in terms of contract that we see in the wider infrastructure space. And contract is essential because regulation changes. And we've seen that in a couple of places, but contracts do remain and they protect investment and they protect developers. Two examples to illustrate this. In Tanzania, me and my colleagues at the World Bank have worked for years in order to put in place the best regulatory framework. And everyone was excited about that regulatory framework a few years back. But what we've seen also is that one political shift can put all that work to bed and consequently put those projects at risk. And that has been for me a key learning. The counterexample of also, and what I have seen very recently, is a program in DRC called the ESSOR program, where you look at DRC, which is a country with very limited regulation in the energy sector and quite dysfunctional institution, in fact. Yet, thanks to a solid contract, that program and scale, obviously, that program has been able to attract, developers and financiers in order to hopefully deliver large-scale projects and impacts we're all after. So, to me, that question of contract and risk allocation is something that is urgently needed. It's urgently needed for us collectively to be able to develop and create projects, but it is also needed urgently because I also feel there could be a risk for projects being signed today without proper contractual protection that may, fail a couple of years into the projects because of political reason, change of regulation, and just overall poor contractual structure. And if that happened, that could also have negative impact on the wider industry. Now, the contract brings me to my second and last point, and last thing that I wanted to share with you today is that what I've learned is that a contract allows you also to de-risk investment. That's not the only way you de-risk a project, but a proper contract allows you to implement quite a bit of de-risking engineering, particularly on the financial side, and that is important. You see, I work now in financing various kind of infrastructure, from telecom to water to transport and energy, obviously. And what I see in the mini-grid space is something that I don't see anywhere else in terms of contracts. When you look at and de-risking instrument, when you look at different projects, more traditional in the infrastructure space, they do have proper contracts, and associated with those contracts, they have a myriad of different guarantee and insurance products that solidify that contract and eventually makes the project bankable, protect the developers, protect their investors. And that I don't see yet in the mini-grid space. I give you two examples. Solar IPPs, now being developed quite rapidly on the continent, and that's a good news for everyone. Now, when we look at a solar IPP, we do look first at the PPA, of course, and see how it is structured, and is often called a secret source of projects. And you have various templates and various approach to PPAs, but those PPAs, most of them are very well structured. No, what you look at, a PPA is not good enough. Having signed a PPA for an IPP is clearly not good enough, and it's not something we would finance. However, you see IPPs and their PPAs being backed by a number of guarantee instruments. You see sovereign guarantees, you see partial risk guarantees, provided by a donor, backstopping a sovereign liability on the contract. You see political risk insurance, such as the one provided by our colleagues at MIGA, that protects the project and its investors from a change in regulations that we also see in the mini-grid space. And that is requirements, that is necessary, and that is elements that we don't see yet in the mini-grid space, and that I believe could really enable a growth. A second example is highways and toll road, and you might think, what toll roads have to do with mini-grid? Well, not much, besides the fact that they are infrastructure, and perhaps more importantly, they face a very similar risk, and in a very prominent way, which is the demand risk. You see, when you build a highway, for example, in Africa, a toll road, you don't know how many cars will pass through. You don't know the impact, or you try to guess, but you don't never fully know the impact of the tariff of that toll road on the volume of cars, and therefore on your revenue. And you see, toll roads are not financed just like that. They're financed based on a PPP model that usually involved some form of grants, because the infrastructure is not bankable on a pure commercial basis. It has a viability gap, just like mini-grids. And what you see also is some form of revenue protection. For example, what we call a minimum revenue guarantees that has been implemented in many developing countries, but is also the way and an instrument that we've seen in pretty much a large share of toll road transaction in Europe to start with. Now, the question that we're asking ourselves is, why shouldn't this type of instruments be made available to the mini-grid space, to you guys, so that if demand is lower than expected based on assessments done by the governments or by yourselves, but for reasons that are external to your performance, why shouldn't there be sharing of the risks there and some form of revenue protection, which in turns would allow lower cost capital to be mobilized for your projects? And so this is something that I believe we need to work on for the space to grow. Of course, there are many more topics to cover on how to collectively help the sector to grow. And I shared those two learnings because they also fit with what we're trying to do here at IFC. As some of you may know already, we're trying to develop, alongside our colleagues from the World Bank and from MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, a program called Scaling Mini-Grids. And that program is intending to bring to the market replicable transactions that have scale and that are de-risked. This obviously will not be the ultimate or only solution for this market, but it will be our humble contribution in trying to advance this agenda that we believe is essential in Africa. And what we're trying to do is to bring the public side of the equation with our colleagues from the World Bank, together with the private side of the equation and IFC providing lower cost debt and equity, as well as our de-risking instrument within the World Bank group, which can be provided by IDA as well as IFC and the World Bank. And to bring that together as a package, because one of the complexity of mini-grid programs is also the myriad of instruments and financing that you need to assemble together to make it work. In relation to that program, I'd like to share with you two recent advancements that I think could be of interest to you and that we are currently working on actively. The first one is the fact that we're currently in advanced discussion with the government of DRC for a large-scale mini-grid program that we hope will be announced in the coming weeks and months. The World Bank has already gathered approval, and I happen to have submitted just today my project package to management for approval. That program is looking at a 400 million capex transaction, overall capex program, sorry, that if it is successful, is likely to represent one of the largest mini-grid transactions on the continent, and a transaction that we hope will pave the way for more. The second good news that I have to share, and that I believe is a good news for us collectively, is an approval from the Green Climate Fund that happened just last week and was not very publicized. It's been an approval for the World Bank Group under the Solar Risk Mitigation Initiative, sorry, the SRMI, for an envelope of grant and risk mitigation funding from the GCF to the World Bank Group. And what's interesting and what you cannot read behind the press release is that within that envelope, a 30 million allocation has been made to guarantee specifically for mini-grids and specifically looking at the demand risk. And so we will be very busy with our colleagues at the World Bank, at MIGA, and within the team here at IFC in trying to structure this guarantee product, of course, counting on your inputs and the good dialogue we have with AMDA and a few of those members. Again, that's some modest contribution, but it's something that I wanted to share as an example of what we were doing and what could be done in the space. I'll conclude my short intervention by commending you for the work that you are doing on the ground, obviously, and the importance of execution. We're seeing quite a bit of projects being developed, and that's really where the front line is. So I'd like to communicate our deep appreciation for your work, as well as deep respect for what you're doing, and really also express our availability to discuss and hopefully support you in those projects. Finally, I'd like to also commend you as a group, as an association, because I believe in the role of industry association in the important dialogue between the public, the private sector, in the case of developing countries, with the donor community as well. And that role is very important. And I see the industry now having a single voice and delivering very strong messages consistently. And I find this really helping everyone, centering around what's important, which is supporting you and your project as a leverage to get impact on the ground for the governments and institutions we work with. So really, I'd like to commend the role of AMDA and the excellent collaboration that we have been able to build over the past few months and years. And to that, I'll thank you very much, and I wish you very good debates and panels for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.